Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again to the FCC. I think this is going to be slightly less controversial than the last lunch I hosted here, but you never know. We're welcoming Zak Dychtwald, who's the founder and head of research of Young China Group and the author of this book, but I'll introduce him in a second. Just a couple of notices about future events, of which there are quite a few now that we're over the summer. I want to emphasize particularly something we've got on in the evening of September the 20th at Bert's. It's a new thing that we haven't done before. I think it's a poetry reading combined with tapas and wine, which is all included in the pretty reasonable price of the ticket. We've got David McCurdy, Tammy Ho, Lai Ming, Chris Song, and Nashua Gallagher all talking about their poetry and reading their poetry. You know, I urge you to sign up for that because it should be a fun event and not too formal, and should be a good source of conversation. That's on the 20th. On the 14th, that's a Friday, we have two events. One is in the morning, a breakfast on the Trump revolution in American foreign policy and the Pacific Rim with Daniel Dresner of the Fletcher School at Tufts. So that's breakfast on the 14th. Then lunch on the 14th. We've got, I think on the veranda here, we've got a talk on academic freedom in a world of authoritarianism by Tim Pringle, who's editor of the China Quarterly and a senior lecturer at the University of London. That's the lunch on the 14th, the Friday. Then looking a bit further ahead, on Wednesday the 26th, we've got an event on Malaysia, which is pretty interesting at the moment, how Malaysia ended 60 years of UMNO rule and what's next. A couple of senior thinkers and officials from Malaysia coming to that. And then even further ahead in October, on the 18th, we've got Christine Low, Kung Wai, who I'm sure many of you know, who's going to talk about the future of Hong Kong. So those are the upcoming events. Today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Zak Dychtwald. He has written this book, as I mentioned, Young China. Unfortunately, I don't think there are many copies available here, but I'm sure you can get it on Amazon. Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. As I said, he's also the head of research and the founder of Young China Group consultancy. And I think I'll just leave it at there, just to say the one sort of nugget of information that's worth keeping in the back of your minds is that there are over 400 million millennials in China. So that's pretty much as many as the rest of the world put together. Zak, thanks.
Hi. Thank you all so much for coming. I was on the way over here trying to think through the fog and haze of a good dose of jet lag. And I remember 8 years ago passing the FCC as an exchange student at the University of Hong Kong and thinking, that looks like a pretty cool place. And if you would have told me that 8 years after that I'd be standing here talking to all of you, I would have said, get out of town. There's no chance. So I want to start this by saying I'm deeply honored and humbled to be here speaking for all of you, and extremely grateful for all of the incredible work that our foreign correspondents do here in Hong Kong and throughout Asia. So thank you so much for having me. To jump right in, I usually like to start with these talks with, why should you care? The fact that I care shouldn't mean a lot. You know, everyone has the thing that they care about, but I think the thing that I care about is also something that you should care about. And the answer is impact. As was just mentioned, there are 400 million millennials in China, actually 417 million. So I'm a millennial from the United States, and everyone seems to want to know what we care about, what we're going to buy, what we're going to vote for, if we're going to vote at all. Are we loyal? Are we interested? Are we apathetic? And in China, there are 5 times more millennials than we have in the United States. China actually has more millennials than there are people in the United States and Canada combined. So whether or not you're interested in macro politics, or especially here in Hong Kong, your local politics, if you're following the global real estate market, or who's buying up the house next to you, if you're thinking about how to cover the movie market in the world, or wondering why the movies that you're bringing your child to see suddenly feature Shanghai and Beijing in ways that they didn't before, whether you're buying or selling sodas, solar panels, or jeans, this young generation will be impacting you personally. The second thing I want to bring up in this vein, and then I'm going to speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, by the way, and then I really encourage everyone here. This is the thing I'm most looking forward to is all of your questions. I have a general idea of what I'm going to say. I'm most interested in what you guys are going to ask, so thank you for thinking of those. The second thing I'm going to say to this regard is that one of the things I really try to do in this book is to have us move out of our point of view and consider what the world looks like from a seat in China. So there's a popular saying on the Chinese internet, it really became popular 2 or 3 years ago, that I never would ever have guessed I'd say at the FCC, but here we go. It's 屁股决定脑袋. It means your butt determines your brain. The idea is that where you sit in the world, the people around you, murmuring around you, your view of the things going on, where you grew up, and how that impacts the way that you see things and how it impacts the way you think about things to a far greater degree than we'd like to admit, influences the way we see the world. Now, the reason I wrote this book is because actually as an exchange student in Hong Kong, I started to travel throughout mainland China and felt pretty pointedly that the experiences of the average young person in China, even though I couldn't grasp them at first, were far different than what was being explained to me through the media. And I have tremendous amount of respect for the work that's done by foreign media, but what we end up focusing on, particularly outside of Asia, are a lot of the extraordinary stories. Super rich, super poor, authoritarian government, apathetic young people, underpopulated ghost cities, overpopulated subways that have to have people crammed onto them. What I became deeply interested in, and what still drives me today, is the ordinary. So in this book that took a little bit longer than I'd like to admit, I try to focus on the ordinary aspects of everyday life in China. So why did I first come to China? It embarrassingly began with a fascination with the future. I was at Columbia University. I'd already run away from California, and I was deciding where to study abroad, and I figured I could either go to Europe and study the past, or go to Hong Kong and see where everyone was saying the future was happening. I made the decision based only on that. I came, I didn't speak a word of Chinese. 6 months later, when I went back to New York, I realized that the thing that was most interesting to me was not the idea of global commerce, but what we were missing about how young people in China, the people I was interacting with, the friends I was developing throughout mainland in my travels, how they were seeing the world. So I decided to move back. I graduated from Columbia, went back to China. I didn't actually speak a word of Chinese at the time. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have a job. I had the address of a hostel. And 4 years later, I was finishing up Young China. So what I really want to accomplish with this book is, and I know this might sound cheesy, but I think of all the people in the world you might understand, I do believe that good relationships are based on understanding. And my hope is that through bringing China up close, making young people in China approachable, we can create better relationships throughout the world between China and the West in particular. So I'm now going to get into the meat of my conversation, which are, I've tried to summarize 4 different ways in which young China is different than old China, particularly in America, and that's my bias, that's my seat in the world. We have a particularly knee-jerk reaction towards the idea of China, a bit of a communist hangover. And so when we imagine China, we typically look at old China. So what I've done is tried to make it clean and simple, the 4 different ways young China is different than old China. After that, I'm going to talk about 3 different ways in which Chinese millennials are different than global millennials, just to set a little bit of context. And after that, I'm hoping you might applaud a little bit and then ask me really difficult questions. So first, the 4 different ways that young China is different than old China. The first is open-minded. I think we often forget that in China in the 1950s and 60s, people's exposure to the outside world was often nothing. A lot of people describe the first hearing of the outside world were slogans like "Chao Ying Gan Mei," to surpass England and catch up with America. But where were England? Where were America? I don't know. People didn't leave the province, let alone the country. I have a friend in Guizhou province who describes, or their parents described to me when I was visiting them, that they used to go to the neighboring village and they had a friend who had a 12-month calendar, Fields of Europe. That was their view of the outside. This young generation in China has grown up incredibly exposed to the outside world. They grew up with the internet, and I know many of us know about the curtailment of the internet in China, but we sort of have to disabuse ourselves of the misconception that this young generation in China doesn't grow up with a fluency in outside culture. They grew up watching our movies, our TV shows, they study our history. I have friends who can quote Barney from How I Met Your Mother and Martin Luther King Jr. in the same sentence. There's a comfort with the outside world that frankly far surpasses Western millennials' comfort with China. So the first point, they're open-minded. The second is poverty. I think we also often forget how deeply poor China used to be, and how the 65-year-olds today in China, some have recounted to me, having to eat tree bark. And we've heard that story to survive the Great Leap Forward in particular. But one of the ways that I sort of like to compare, in 1969, my dad, who's 19, was deciding whether or not to go to Woodstock in New York. Does everyone know what Woodstock is? It was a music festival. It was about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. What I like about this idea is that you can sort of think about what goes into that decision. What was his opinion about sex? What was his relationship to his parents? He probably had free time. He probably had disposable income. He was interested in a sort of rebellious sort of music. That was the whole wrapping anthropologically around that decision. In 1969, my friend's parents in China were going through the Cultural Revolution. And so poverty was the defining characteristic of old China. This young generation has grown up in what they believe in, and what there's tremendous amount of evidence for, the greatest rags to riches story in the history of capital. Isn't it ironic that the world's biggest communist government has ushered in the largest capitalistic revolution in the modern world? To contextualize that, so I'm born in 1990, to give it away here. When I was born, from when I was born to today, our per capita GDP, so sort of the quality of a life, has increased 2.5 times. So that means the type of tutoring my parents were maybe able to afford for me, the cars that my neighbor had, the types of trips that people were able to take either nationally or abroad, that's increased about 2.5 times. We all know that GDP per capita isn't a perfect metric, but it's a pretty good one when you're comparing globally. My peers in China, my friends in China, born in the exact same year, in their lifetime, they've witnessed the per capita GDP increase 27 times. Maybe it's just a developing country thing. India, in that same amount of time, 5 times. Brazil, 3.2, Germany, 2.0. Actually, when you take all of the top 70 top performing economies in the world, there is only one other economy that's even in the double digits, that's Vietnam. China is at 27. What this young generation has witnessed in their lifetime is unlike anything else that any other cohort, any other millennial cohort in the world has witnessed. The amount of change that they've witnessed. That is their ecosystem. The rule of the land is rapid change. How does that influence the way they see the world? The third is, in China there used to be a lot of young people and not a lot of old people. As recently as 1950, the average life expectancy was 40. You didn't retire, you died. And there was about 5 or 6 children per family. So that created an entire society where there was a lot of young people and very few old people. The bottom supported the top of that pyramid. We all know that China then had one of the largest baby booms in history. I think we forget that in 1950, China's population was only 540 million people. 30 years later, that had swelled to 980 million people. These are the people who built China's modern manufacturing wonder. They're now turning 65. After that baby boom came the world's largest baby bust. So that pyramid has more or less been inverted. What we now have is this young China. They've grown up in the 4-2-1 world. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child. Used to be a lot of kids, very few old people. Now there's a lot of old people, very few kids. And the fourth major difference is clout. If you were to ask a young person growing up in China in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s, is China strong? Can China lead? The answer would be no. If you were to ask a young person growing up in China today, is China strong? Can China lead? most expect it. 4 differences between old China and young China. The next portion, and I hope I'm doing okay on time. Wonderful. The next portion is I want to talk about the 3 differences between global millennials, or particularly Western millennials, honestly, and Chinese millennials. Actually, some of the really interesting work that I'm embarking on with Young China Group is trying to contextualize Chinese millennials, not just between East and West, but in the entire context of emerging economies globally. That's some of the really exciting research that we're trying to take on over this next year. But I'm not there yet, so we're going to start with East and West. With China, there's 3 major ways that Chinese millennials are different than Western millennials. I'm going to do American millennials just to keep it simple. So the first is scale. I already went over that. 5 times more in China than we have in the United States. I would add that there's actually more millennials in China than there are millennials in North America, Europe, and the Middle East combined. The second part that's different, and again, we're thinking about individuals, not just macro, but what does a life look like in China? The second part is they're extraordinarily competitive and hardworking. I have some friends from school with me today, and they would say, well, we went to a pretty good school, we're competitive and hardworking. No. I went to a public school in California, and I certainly did get, taught a lesson when I went to Columbia, but all the same, when I was a kid and I was going to swim practice, my peer in China was studying. When I had friends who were trying out for the cheerleading team, when they were on the speech and debate team, their peer in China was studying. When we were having sleepovers, when we were playing video games, when we were playing outdoors, our peers in China were studying. In chapter 3 of the book, I talk about an experience, actually 9 months after I graduated from school, I was teaching at a weekend school for 5 or 6-year-olds. It wasn't, I had to wear a ridiculous outfit. It wasn't the most honorable thing I've ever done, but it was interesting and it paid for my travels and Chinese classes, and that's what life was, that first year at least. And I had 6 young people in the class. One of them in particular was named Jianguo, so create the country, Jianguo. And 5 or 6-year-olds are adorable everywhere, and Jianguo was no exception. During the class, we were playing with robots. It was actually a coding class for 6-year-olds, relatively affluent 6-year-olds. And it was a relatively normal class, except for there was one thing that was different. In the back of the class, there was a glass barricade. Behind that barricade, there was 12 parents and 24 grandparents watching every twist of a robot, every tap of a keyboard. When class got out, I usually went to socialize with some of the parents. And all of a sudden, I heard a wail come out of the side of the room. And I turn over, and there is Jianguo, crying. Around him are his father and grandfather sort of arguing about how things should be going down. People are patting his back. And his grandmother and mother are hunched over him with pieces of paper. I go over to see what's going on. And I see that on the pieces of paper are words. Molecule. Seashell, microscope. These are the words that we had learned that day in class. I asked his mom, what's up? I didn't assign any homework. She said, Jianguo in 12 years is going to have to take the Gaokao, the college entrance exam. I'm trying to give him a leg up. We often think of this young generation in China as Xiao Huangdi, right? The little emperors. The idea is that in that 4-2-1 society, funneling down is a tremendous amount of resources, and that's true. But with those resources comes a tremendous, crippling amount of pressure, of expectations. So for these little emperors, heavy hangs the head that lies the crown. The project of childhood in China is fundamentally different, defined by the rule of the land, which is Gaokao. The third major difference, and I expect that this might be the most contentious one, which will be fun, is pride. I live in a country who just elected someone, and of course it wasn't young people who elected this person, on the idea of making America great again, which suggests that we don't think America is too great today. There's no doubt that America is in a certain identity crisis, and I think you see that around Europe as well. Who are we? Who are we going to be? Certain apathy amongst young people. Polling numbers play that out. In China, there's this feeling that they are becoming great now. You go back to those numbers that I talked about, the idea of per capita GDP. I call that the witness index. In their life, they have witnessed so much change, so much proof of upward mobility, that especially when they compare it to the outside world, what they have feels particularly special. Like I said before, this generation isn't cloistered. 2/3 of all passport holders in China are under the age of 38. They're millennials. 1/3 of all people studying abroad in the United States are from China. 1/3. The next best represented country is India, which actually has a slightly larger millennial population, but they're only at 1/10. This young generation has grown up interacting with the outside world actually far more than their parents. And much of that interaction has left people less enamored with other styles of governance, other styles of living, rather than more enamored. I can give you an example. When the post office closes for study abroad students, and they think, would that happen back in China? When our government shuts down. Obviously, there are trade-offs, and the young generation in China sees their government as deeply flawed, but effective. One of the ways that I sort of like to characterize this perception of upward mobility within China, this real sense of pride, and not just what, I think we do a lot of focusing on what the government has created, but if you've seen your parents create wealth for your family, if you watched a TV grow in your household, if you remember when you couldn't afford a refrigerator when you were young, and you've watched your family, your neighbors, your province grow into that, that's you don't think of that as some big invisible arm guiding you. That's personal. And this young generation feels personal pride in what they've been able to accomplish as a country and as a people and as a family. One quick story I like to tell is the story of the Olympics. In 1996, it was the Atlanta Olympics. For a lot of young people I know, this was the first time they had actually ever seen America. A lot of young people in China described to me maybe not having a TV themselves, but going around and they would gather in a neighbor's house or what have you, or a local restaurant, and watch the TV. Tom, who is the main character in chapter 12, he remembers his mom saying to him, "Look, there's America. There's the most powerful country in the world." America in particular, and obviously England as well, but America often acted as the foil for China on the rise, sort of the invisible competition by which China would measure itself. It still is to a certain extent, and you're watching that play out in today's politics. So Tom remembers watching, and that year, America won, I believe, 48 gold medals, either 51 or 48, and China won 16, which was already a coup at the time. In 1996, the per capita GDP was between $400 and $500. There weren't a lot of people focusing on the sports department at the time. Fast forward to 2008, Beijing Olympics. People remember gathering in their own houses, gathering at friend houses on relatively large TVs at the time, and watching the opening ceremony. Did everyone here see the opening ceremony in Beijing? So pundits have often called that the greatest show that the human race has put on in the history of our species, for context. And a lot of the people describe that as China's coming out party for the world. Look at China, we are unified, we are choreographed, gliding into the future. But as much as people were describing that, as much as the people putting on the Olympics were describing that to the outside world, they were also showing people within China, look at what we are today. A lot of these exhibitions of strength, people forget that you're also showing people within China, convincing them that this is, look at us. That year, China won 51 gold medals, the United States won 36. So what's the value of a gold medal? Nothing. But what's the value of pride? And my question is, in a lot of the questioning we do of this young generation, their ability to access information, their ability to think for themselves, are we underestimating their ability to make decisions about what they have in the world and whether or not it's good or bad? The book is called Young China. You guys can reach me at zak@youngchinagroup.com. Feel free to shoot me a message. I really look forward to your questions. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think come and sit down, Zach. That was, I have to say, I think that was bloody wonderful. That was one of the best and most, the clearest explanations I've heard from a speaker for a long time. So we really appreciate it. But of course, it does also raise a lot of questions. So anybody who has one, I urge you to raise your hand. And if you could just briefly identify yourselves, and then there is a roving mic, so we'll start over there. Just tell us briefly who you are and ask a question for Zach.
My name is Bhaskar. I work for European Supermarket Group. Thank you very much for your speech. You spoke a lot about the optimism and the pride factor for the young millennials. Do you see any anxieties they are grappling with?
Without a doubt, I actually call this generation the restless generation because most of what they're going through is anxiety-driven. Which is to say, in China right now, I think of this generation as being between two tectonic plates. On one hand, you have this relatively traditional idea of what it means to be Chinese in the modern world, family-oriented. The idea of getting married, increasingly owning property has become packaged in that. And on the other side, you have the pressures of modernity. The idea that you need to be educated for 4 years or beyond to survive in this job market. The demographic troubles of marriage, the relationship between the marriage market and the property market, and those two things are grinding against each other, grinding. At its fault line is this young, born after 90 generation. And so what they're faced with is not questions about needs. Their parents and their grandparents had to ask subsistence questions. How do I get enough food, water, shelter to provide for myself and my family? This young generation has to focus on identity questions. Who do I want to be? Now, as a 28-year-old currently going through these identity questions myself, I can tell you that that causes a tremendous amount of anxiety. The housing market is a great example. Young men in China believe that it's become somehow wrapped into this traditional concept that in order to be seen as an eligible bachelor, they have to get married.
Successful person.
Bit of logic issues there. In order to be seen as an eligible bachelor, they have to first own property in order to provide 安全感, the sense of safety or security. The IMF recently came out with a number that said 7 out of the 10 least livable cities in terms of property price as it's related to average income, 7 out of 10 of them are in China. And so you have this thing as a young person where you really want to get married because your parents are putting a lot of pressure, and every time you go home for New Year, your parents are giving you pressure and your aunts and uncles are giving you pressure. So you end up having to figure out how to buy property. Well, what they end up doing is they borrow from their parents. Now, as a young man in China, there's this idea of 孝顺. It means filial piety. It's a terrible translation because I would never casually say, I'm going to go be filially pious to my parent, but it's a relatively central idea in China. So to be a good person in China is often to be a good child, capital G. So you have these young people who tremendously want to look after their parents. They want to start a family in order to make them proud. But in order to start a family, they have to first own property, which means they have to borrow from their parents. And they become known as parent eaters. So it's this friction between ideas of tradition and modernity as they grind against each other. And this young generation is sort of pushing back for space. So there's a tremendous amount of anxiety in this young generation, but there's also an excitement.
Just a related question, thanks. You spoke about crippling expectations, and when you were having fun, your peers in China were all studying. Does that make people narrow-minded? Does it make them less interested in non-academic things or things that aren't necessarily to do with financial success or financial security? Arts, culture, sport, whatever. Do you find that sort of worrying, or do you think that that's not the case?
Broadly speaking, yes, it does make people less interested. On the other hand, as these young people are being increasingly exposed to the outside world, they're realizing that their project of childhood is relatively globally unique. So a lot of people are pushing back on that as well. So the older generation in China, because of their necessity-driven mentality, is often summarized by their ability to eat bitter, by their ability to 吃苦, right? To withstand difficult things for long periods of time at the prospect of delayed gratification. Delayed not for a month, but maybe for a decade or to a next generation. This young generation who doesn't need that eat bitter mentality, but for whom that mentality defined their childhood, now they're wanting to play. They're wanting to 活在当下, to live in the moment, to actually enjoy their lives now. And that's in reaction to their overbearing childhood.
Thank you. There was somebody over this side, I think at the back there, yes, and then somebody over there, and then Florence, and then some others, yeah. We'll
Hi,
there
Zach.
first.
My name's William. I'm just a private businessman, I guess you'd say. My question is, how, in your opinion, how environmentally aware do you think the millennials in China are, say, in comparison to the US, in particular California, with single-use plastic, solar power, all the things, the revolution that's coming and is, we hope, being driven by that generation, is on the ground, is that the priority for the Chinese millennials?
No. Pollution is. It's really, I think, when you think about social impact questions, it's important to stratify these concerns. And at the top, you have pollution. So there's a real pushback against, again, when you think of wanting to enjoy yourself now, if you can't go outside to play basketball, which you're newly realizing you kind of like to do, the pollution issue, I mean, they're surrounded by it. So often the issues that catch the interest of this young generation are the ones that surround them. Pollution first, but then you have food and water safety as well. As this young generation is becoming parents, you have the dairy issues that have, involved Hong Kong for years. And, but plastic straws, no. For the upper crust, often those who have studied abroad, yes. But again, those sea turtles, as they're called, often are not representative of the majority.
Over there, lady first, yeah.
Thank you, Zach. I really enjoyed the talk, and I have to say, congratulations. It's very courageous to write about a huge group of people and make generalizations in a book that's very well rated. So congratulations. I teach at Chinese University of Hong Kong, University of Virginia, and Tsinghua. So I'm trying to write a book about young people in a different context. And so I'd like to ask you 3 questions. One is data. Because for Taiwan and Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, I have all this data. But there are so few surveys and data to support the generalizations we make. Number one, have you come across any? And in relation to 2 specific questions, one is, how do they feel about the party? On the day that the term limit was lifted, my students were crying. They were more depressed than I was, my mainland Chinese students. And I couldn't quite understand what they were trying to say. So they seem to have this ambivalent relationship with the party. The second is, once they come to University of Virginia, mainland Chinese students become very religious. Our number 1 activity for mainland Chinese students in the United States is going to church and becoming born-again Christian. So can you talk about those 2 things, politics and religion?
Thank you. Sorry, just one thing. You said on the day that something was lifted, I didn't quite hear you, the party.
On the day that Xi Jinping's term
Yes,
limit
got
was
it.
lifted.
Okay, thank you, yeah.
Sorry, what was your name? Shirley, I'm writing it down. Thank you for the question. So data. The way I wrote this book, about a third of it is anecdote driven because I want these to feel personal. I want to bring this generation up close. The second third is secondary research, most of it in Chinese because a lot of that never gets translated, but also Pew does relatively good surveying and not all of. The third portion was a tremendous amount of interviews through 4 years living there. And something that I made a large effort to do was to not write about anyone or anything or include any characters that I could not switch the main character in a chapter with 10 other people that I had met, and the meat of it wouldn't be true. Is it a perfect metric? Probably not. But it was the best I felt I could do. By the way, a lot of the data that I was frustrated that I couldn't get, we are now, that's why I started Young China Group, to be able to substantiate and really discover new things that I wanted to with the book. But I mean, as I'm sure you know, in trying to write a book, authors aren't particularly well remunerated, so it's difficult to figure out how to do all that.
Yeah.
The relationship with the government, I think you picked up on a particular touchstone or touch point. So I used to say that a lot of young people feel relatively ambivalent towards the government. They treat it like the weather. You could dress for it, you could sort of prepare for it and predict it. You could complain about it, but you couldn't change it. So you just existed within it. And I think for a lot of people, that's the ecosystem within which they live. So you think about the other options, only 9% of the Chinese population has a passport. So even though 2/3 are millennials, it's not like people are leaving. But when the ban was lifted, that was the most rattling moment I have experienced in my years of being in China. And it's not because they think that the current leader is so disastrous, but that the constitutional precedent, so much of the weight that we put on the legitimacy of the system that China's created had to do with the transition of power. And particularly at some of the fine universities that you're describing, many students recognize that. So even though in this short term, or in the short to mid-term, people aren't particularly worried about the ramifications of this switch, but what it means is 30 or 40 years from now, if there's a less capable leader, there is now precedent constitutionally to change things entirely. And that is deeply troubling. So this last year and a half, I would say recently, there has been much more agitation in that relationship than the moments that I was describing in this book. Second, the issue of religion. I'm not a professional on this, and I actually took out a chapter on my experiences in Tibet because I didn't think they were representative enough, again, by the earlier metric. I did do extensive interviews in Chengdu and in Aba, and in, Chengdu is the entryway to Tibet, and you're starting to see a huge number of young people in the realization that they're probably going to lose the fight with consumerism, searching for different ways to justify that and find purpose and meaning. In this process of individuation and deciding who we are, religion for the world over often is part of finding purpose and meaning, and something that means more than just the grind to find money. So I did 100 interviews, and this is actually in this book. Does China have faith? Does China have religion? And people half-jokingly replied, money. That was the most common response I got. And the others who had sort of moved past that found that aspect deeply troubling.
Thanks. Florence, and then...
Thank you. Florence de Changier, report for Le Monde. Zak, you mentioned first the mix, I'm also fighting with jet lag, the mix of respect for what has been achieved from this generation, so respect for the government, respect for the previous generation. At the same time, large exposure to the outside world and a much more open mind setting. You just said as well that the government, they take it as a little bit as the weather, they accept it. I'm wondering what kind of citizens, what kind of political animal is this enormous generation? Because if we know what they are, we can guess what China will be, right? In 20 or 30 years.
No, it's a great question. And again, I think there has been some difference in hue over this last year and a half in particular as people are feeling it out. In general, I think one of the issues that we often overlook is the anti-corruption campaign and the impact that that's had on this young generation's perception of what a life can be in China. So when we talk about the government, we really have to, again, stratify what we mean when we think of freedoms. What freedoms are these young people having? What are they lacking? I said earlier, or I mentioned earlier to you, Victor, that the freedom to vote, for instance, when 51% of Americans don't go out to do it, isn't particularly valued. So what freedoms matter? And freedom of information is a particularly ornery one. So as that has clamped down, as the pendulum has swung back over this last year and a half, that's been troublesome for people. In general, though, when I say the anti-corruption campaign, the biggest freedom that people desire is the ability to get what you earn. It used to be, and Pew has good research for this from before, I think it was 2013 and then 2014 as well, comparing the 2 years. The anti-corruption campaign began at the end of 2012, and we know it as sort of political jockeying at the top. That's how it's often covered. And the catchphrase is catching tigers and swatting flies. If you're in a village, you don't see a lot of tigers. You hear about it, there's stories about it, but maybe once every 3 years a tiger comes in and rips some people up, but that's it. Flies bother everyone. The Pew data from 2013 reflects that the number one issue, more than pollution, more than hazardous water and food, that people in China perceived was the issue with corruption. There was a belief that even if you were capable, you could not get ahead in life because you had to spend half of your startup money on guanxi and paying people off. And even if you bribed that person, you might not get in. So when the anti-corruption campaign, which did look like jockeying at the top, what it did at the bottom was suddenly those flies were terrified of taking bribes. There was a real perception, whether or not it's true, there was a real perception that suddenly things were possible. If I wanted to start up, if I wanted to create my own business, I don't have to spend half of my startup costs on Mao Tai and cigarettes. I can put the forms through and then I'll have my opportunity to change my life. So that has assuaged a lot of the irritation that young people felt towards the government until, again, what was brought up earlier by Shirley, some of the more recently agitating elements. And again, we're thrown into that, what's the scale of it? Right now, I would characterize a lot of that feeling towards the government and towards these infractions on what we would perceive to be freedom as more of a bummer than a breaking point. But it's something that we absolutely should track, particularly the freedom of information and the freedom to do what you want, to get ahead in life in the ways that you want.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Joel Lakin, IPPF, that's energy and power stuff. So we have a question to bring up. We do a lot in China all the time. And we appreciate the fact that this younger generation is remarkably different. But here in Hong Kong and outside of China, everybody's got a rich cornucopia of data and information, YouTube, Google, Gmail, whatever, that we can tap into. In China, we were just there for 2-3 weeks, getting very frustrated. My staff couldn't get information that I wanted them to get because they're dependent upon Baidu and Tencent and some other crap, CC or QQ, whatever it's called. Very limited. Well, how is this wonderful new generation really going to tap into the outside world around these crazy firewalls, which keeps them locked in and insular, in my opinion?
I'm sorry, what was your name?
I'm sorry, what was my name?
Yes.
I'm Joel
Hi,
Lakin.
Joel. Thank you for your question.
L-A-Y-K-I-N.
So first, I have to push back a little bit on this idea of Tencent being a crap company. I think it's one of the most innovative things that we're seeing in the world right now, and I think we grossly underestimate the capacity for innovation and outside-of-the-box thinking because we think of Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent as worse Googles. Recently, Google actually got in touch with me to talk about this issue because one of the fascinating things that is limiting China's access to the outside world is not how poor Baidu is, and the algorithms are slightly different, so you do have to understand how to use that as a research tool. 54% of the content on the internet is in English. 1.4% of it is in Chinese. So there's without a doubt a firewall that's blocking a lot of people in China, particularly the more apathetic, from accessing information that would be beyond the hoped for mental diet as delivered or as prescribed by the government. With that being said, I think we also overestimate the amount of content that is around in the world that's available to young people in China. Now, I don't want to paint a picture that this sort of lack of access in China isn't real. It's totally real. But is a lack of access to Google the real thing that's standing in the way of young people from accessing real information? I don't think that's the case. I would say, particularly, again, I keep bringing up this last year and a half, but even slightly before that, when they censored Under the Dome, when that came down, there was this real feeling that the pendulum in China on censorship was swinging back. It looked pretty good for a long time. And then when that was censored, it looked like it was swinging back, and that has been one of the more aggravating, concerning parts of young people's lives, particularly the upper crust, particularly English-speaking, who are able to access content and fluently engage with content from around the world. I will say here, and I think this is one of the more important points, there's something I refer to called the Shanghai fallacy, which is this idea that we go to Shanghai, we have a good steak, we interact with our English-speaking guides and our English-speaking students who are around us, And they give us a version of the world, and we go back expecting that for China, modernization means westernization. That what these young people want is just to become like millennials in the West, but with different haircuts. And for those of us who spend more time in China, in second, third, fourth, fifth, and beyond tier cities, we recognize that Shanghai is the least representative city in all of China, and that the people who are incredible oral English speakers are also often not representative of the majority voice within China. And I don't think this is for everyone, particularly our distinguished journalists who are based in China often have superior linguistic skills, really. With that being said, I find that a lot of the lack of access on our end to the majority conversation in China ends up shading a lot of our commentary on what people ought to want versus what this young generation actually does want.
Thank you. Gentlemen, now we've only got time for a couple more, so just gentlemen here, and then there, yeah.
Thank you, Zach. My name is John Antweiler. I am a retired banker. Question, I just found your talk exceptional, really good.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could project forward a little bit and say, what are the implications of 417 million millennials in China, educated, forward-looking, proud? What are the implications in the next 20 or 30 years?
Thank you.
Thank you. So as a science fiction fan, I'm totally going to leap on the opportunity to sort of imagine what it could look like. I could be entirely wrong. But one of the major implications, if we want to talk sector by sector, that becomes more difficult. But one of the major implications to me is this idea of cultural gravity. For the last, really since World War II, but you could argue even before that, for the last stretch of time, much of the way that the world spins is around this Western gravitational core. Even as the Eastern economies, the tiger economies rose, frankly, Hong Kong included to a certain extent, because of their economic and political consequence, they often end up falling into the gravitational force, both culturally but also in the business world of the Western world. And what's so interesting about China and this young generation as they become more of economic and political consequence around the world, they're so big, there's so many of them, that and they're so proud that there is this really relatively brittle sense of what it means to be Chinese that remains intact, especially as pride, and we can argue, pride in government or pride in who they are, or specific where that pride is aimed at, but there's this real sense that we are Chinese and we don't want to become something else. So suddenly you have this other gravitational core that's rising. And for the first time really in the modern world, this generation has the potential to change the way that the Western world spins. If you're to write in Microsoft Word, and I hope this is still true, I haven't checked this recently, Westernization, they'll capitalize the W for you. It's this proper idea. If you're to write Easternization, red squiggly lines. Idea doesn't exist. That to me is the largest implication.
Thank you. Last two gentlemen here, and then I think there's one at that table there. Yeah, okay.
Claudio Ludlow, good to meet you. Zach, wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I'm just a generation before you, and I can see a huge gap in terms of political consciousness between the XYs and the millennials. In terms of, and not to mention your parents in 1969, how you mentioned Woodstock, but the reality, they were very politically involved at that generation. My question is regarding, you were in a very unique situation to do qualitative interviews and not really go into the intimacy of the students and the people from your generation. And my question is pretty much what we've been asking, but not directly. What is your sense? Is there a political consciousness around them, and what's the basis? What can you mention a little bit about that?
Yes. First, thank you for your question. The answer to that is yes, there is a political consciousness. Is it the political consciousness that we'd hope for the young generation? Many of us? Probably not, my parents included, by the way. I grew up in Berkeley, if that helps color what where my seat was growing up in the world. So, we have, I grew up in a politically active area. So there's 2 points I would make here. The first is a point that I've made, which is that this young generation in China sees their government as flawed, really flawed, and flaws that they can recognize and pinpoint, and flaws that I would say I agree with. Those are, if I were to make a list and my friends in China would make a list, they'd match up mostly. I know it sounds like I'm really sunny on things. I'm not. At the end of the day, I'm trying to write and now try to do business and have friends and go back and forth from and want the best for, really want the best for my friends there. It's a second home to me. But while it's flawed, there's this perception that all governments are flawed and at least theirs is effective. So it begs the question, and this is the question, this is inevitably where we go, if the efficacy, if the effectiveness of the government in providing enormous economic success wanes, if that's what provides the legitimacy in the eyes of young people, what happens when those numbers drop, as they inevitably will? And I think with that, we often underestimate the integrity of the pride young people feel. Because it's not just, boy, I have a chance to get a good job. It's, look what we've created through hard work. And if you actually read the narrative, one of the more interesting things that I've done is I've compared history books from high school in China and Taiwan and the United States when they're talking about a lot of world events. And it's totally fascinating. I've also sat in on party classes in colleges. Throughout college, there's party classes where you have to take a test on what the Communist Party is doing, and I've gone in and worn, a mask and a hat, but people didn't really care anyways. And you hear the way the government describes what's going on in China, and again, they make a list of flaws that I would make. Do they talk about information incursion? Not as much, without a doubt. But in terms of the health of the economy, the health of the local economy, what matters to people, they're identifying where they go wrong. And there's a sense that together we're going to build it. The government has created ownership in the narrative with young people. And by the way, the narrative shifted seriously after 1991, I believe. And I write about this, but there was actual a legitimate shift in what people were being taught that changes to a far more compelling narrative. The second point I would make within this is that the alternatives in the world don't look particularly attractive. There's a good amount of social proof that's been drummed up by the propaganda corps within China, without a doubt, but there's a good amount of social proof that democracy doesn't export particularly well. And that even the ones that people have long looked to for stability, for opportunity, aren't providing those things to their people anymore. And not just President Trump in America, but if you're studying abroad in the United States and you want to go to the land of opportunity to work in a research lab, there's a very low chance that you'll be able to get an H-1B visa and stay. And even if you find an institution to support you in that, you then have to go into a lottery, and there's a 1 in 3 chance that you'll be picked. So there's a feeling that you're not really wanted. There's a saying, and I'm going to leave it on this, that's really famous. Deng Xiaoping, what is it? 摸着石头过河, forgive the butchered tones if I did. Crossing the river by feeling the stones. And we all know that to be a beautiful way of being like, I don't know where I'm going, I'm going to feel my way through this 1 foot at a time. What we don't talk about is what that means. It means China's in a third world nation really at the time, and they're trying to cross the rushing river of history to the other bank of modernization. On the left, they see democracy, really the American-style democracy at this time, and that's a relatively well-founded bridge. It's sturdy, people have crossed it, and it looks to be relatively successful, especially at the time. That's one thing. On the right side, they see another bridge, and it looks really good. It's communism, it looks great kind of from afar, but when you get up close, there's some potholes in it, and it doesn't, maybe not a lot of people have traveled to the other bank through that, and they looked both ways and went in the middle. They're crossing the river by feeling the stones. And so what China has created today, in 1950, China was the Communist Party. In 1980, the Communist Party. 1993. And then today, they're still the Communist Party. None of those governments look that similar. What's similar about all of them is their pragmatism. So to call it communist or try to label into something that a lot of us have a very strong reaction to isn't accurate. It confuses more than it clarifies. And so what they're doing is something entirely different. And this young generation, in a lot of ways, recognizes that.
Thanks. Very last question, because we've run out of time. If you could keep it fairly short, that'd be great. Thanks.
Richard Ward. Let me just put it this way. If at Berkeley you can buy a T-shirt that has Chinese characters on it, but that's probably the only place. You see a lot of English used as a totem, if you will. With 400 and some million people speaking Chinese, being the dominant group globally in that demographic group, how does that translate in terms of cultural reach and influence, particularly given that these two geographic or magnetic poles you've described both seem to be charged north and repel each other to some degree, and there's a lack of understanding of both sides. How does that culturally play out on the...
You mean outside China? In the wider world?
In terms of that group's influence,
Sure.
in terms of the thinking of everyone else.
Right.
I'll be quick, but I'm going to quickly break it up into two parts. Thank you for this great question. The first part is what you're starting to see now is the birth of what I call cool with Chinese characteristics. There's not the feeling that if I smack an English word on my shirt anymore that suddenly I'm international and therefore cool. I think one of the great examples of this is 中国有嘻哈, the rap of China. The most watched episode of Game of Thrones got 30 million views, the very most watched one. The average episode of Rap of China, which was a reality show streamed on iQIYI, got 200 million views. So within China, there's starting to be a real cultural capital that the idea of 中国风, that the idea of like a Chinese style is cool, and that we don't have to imitate Western stuff. To the second part, and I think this is actually the defining question for China in the world, this idea of can you create something that is attractive internationally? I think for consumer-facing brands, that's probably the most difficult part. But when you see how much of what we have is made in China, when you see how much of the real new technology that's emerging in the mobile space, when you see the political reach and the creation of economic dependencies in China and the region, that is a slower, easier way. Is that in our face consumerism? Are we all going to start reading Chinese? Probably not. But the influence of China, I mean, you know, if I'm going to bring my cousin to a movie now, it's likely that China will be in it just for the effort to sort of get up close with the government in China and then have a second opening there. We're already starting to see China influence our consciousness.
Thank you very much. Zak, that was a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. And maybe you'll be around for a few minutes if anybody wants to grab you or ask your opinion on something. Thank you very much to a great audience, and thank you to Zak. This is our little presentation. It falls well below the threshold for what might constitute corruption, so you're welcome to use it anytime you like.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.